The only thing that's constant in software engineering is change. It may be from a dependency that got updated, or the requirements have changed, or there is a bug in the implementation, and other countless reasons that's out of our control. In between all of this, what is often overlooked are technical debts that gets accumulated over time in the project, and so it's important to keep them in check from time to time. Hey everyone, welcome back to another one. In this episode, we're going to take a pause and spend some time maintaining the Headlines app and fix a few bugs here and there. If you're new here, I highly recommend watching the previous episodes. To be specific, we're going to update our dependencies and then we'll be refactoring any breaking changes in the app from updating our dependencies. We'll also fix a few layout bugs with eGUI, and finally, we'll clean up a few log and warning lines from the app. So, with that said, let's jump into it. So we're back in our editor and we're starting from where we left off, and here's the commit hash for your reference. The first thing we'll do is update the dependencies of the crates. So I'm going to approach it from inside out. First, I'm going to update the news API crates dependencies. For that, let me go to the news API subdirectory, and I'm going to use the cargo add subcommand, and I'm going to put the names of the crate that we want to update. For this, let's update it separately because it needs an additional flag. I'm going to run this, and as you can see, we have the dependencies updated. And for RigVasm, which is on the Wasm32 platform, we can probably use the target flag. Not sure if this will work, but let's see. Okay, looks like it did work, but partially. It added an extra section, which we don't want. Let's remove that and replace the older one with 0.5. So with that, the news API crates dependencies have been updated. So let's make sure we did not break anything, and I'm going to run cargo build on the root directory, and looks like everything works just fine. So then let's go to the headlines directory and update its dependencies. So I'm going to cd into headlines and going to use the cargo add subcommand again, quickly typing the name of the crate we want to update, and okay, if I can spell subscriber correctly, and there you go, we have this updated as well. Great. So same for the Wasm32 dependency. Let's do cargo add target Wasm32. We're going to put tracing Wasm blue timers and Wasm bindgen futures. Okay, let's remove this as before. Now let's try to build this again just to make sure everything is still intact. It looks like we have quite a few breaking changes here, especially with the update of the eFrame crate to version 0.17. So let's try to fix these errors. And before I do that, I'm going to run bacon just so we have our errors update as we make changes to the code. So the first error that we have is about a type called ctxref that's nowhere to be found. And it appears that this type was either removed or it was renamed in 0.17 release of eFrame. So in order to find that, I'm going to open up my browser window and I'm going to check out the GitHub repository for eGUI. And from here, I'll go to the releases page, and for version 17, I'll just check out the tip of the comment and I'll then click on browse files. And I'll just take a look at one of the Hello World example projects just to figure out what changes were made to the context object. So I can go to eFrame, and within examples directory under helloworld.rs, if we scroll down here, you can see the context object name has been changed from ctxref to context. So the fix should be simple. We can just replace the ctxref with context and things should work as before. And then the next error we have is about the frame type not needing the generic lifetime param. So the fix is very simple. We can simply remove this from here. Similarly for the other occurrences. And then we have a few errors on the way the frame object is being accessed in the setup method. So let's remove the mute keyword. And then we have some type mismatch for the storage params. So So here the option wrapper has to go away, and we will also remove dyn as it expects an ampersand of EPI storage.
Much later.
Okay, it seems like there's something more involved here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip the setup method altogether. I'm going to comment this out and we'll tackle this later. And let's go ahead and fix the other errors. So we will remove the mute keyword here. And the next error is about the way we initialize custom fonts in eFrame, which now seems to take a font data type instead of a cow type that we had before. Let's figure out how to fix that. I'm going to search for the font data type in the updated eGUI docs, and hopefully we should find something. So we need to find about font data, and yeah, we have something related to font data here. Okay, and if I check for the implementations, we have a method called from static I think we can use. So let's use the font data from static method and update our initialization here. So instead of using cow borrowed here, we can remove this and replace this with font data from static, and we'll call include bytes macro, which has the path to our font, and font data isn't imported, so let's import that. And then I figured that we don't need to set the font sizes here, as they can be set later on as needed. And the only change that we need to do is to set the families attribute of the font definitions object to Meslo NGS for the proportional font family. So with that, the font initialization has been fixed. And then let's move ahead to the other errors. And if you take a look at this, it says that no method name textile was found. It looks like the way we initialize labels have also been updated. So let's figure out that. Let's look for label. It looks like instead of label having the ability to set text styles, we now have something called rich text, using which we can set text styling. So let's check the API for rich text, and hopefully we should have a text style method, and that's our method here. Let's replace the way we initialize the label with rich text.new, and we'll move the text style method call on the rich text object, and this should fix the label initialization for us. Then there's also a change with how hyperlinks are initialized, so let's also check for the hyperlink type. Okay, so we now have a new method called from label and URL, it seems. So let's update that. The text for the hyperlink goes as the first param and then the URL, and this text method call goes away. Okay, another error down. Next one is again with the label initialization. So instead of a plain string, we have rich text new, and we'll move the text style method call as part of rich text, and this has been updated as well, and we'll do the same for others. Then in lib.rs, we have some errors due to how the frame type is being referenced. So let's update that. This is going to take an immutable reference. And looks like the scroll area container widget is supposed to be initialized in a different way. So let's check for the method. And it seems like we don't have the auto-sized method anymore, but the one we should be using is probably the vertical function here. Let's try using the vertical method, and yeah, it seems to be working. And then we have a few of the label errors again. We'll do the same here. And finally, after a lot of back and forth, we finally fixed all of the errors. But before we go ahead, I just want to make sure that we are also able to build on the web platform as well, because all this while we were fixing errors from the build on our native platform. So from the last episode, we had this start web script that builds headlines as a package for the WASM32 target. So we can run that just to make sure we are able to build even for the WASM 32 platform. And to a surprise, it seems that 0.17 release of eGUI has some issues with being compatible on the WASM 32 platform. Specifically, I can see that there's some issue with eGUI Glow, which is one of the rendering crate. I'll spend some time figuring out where exactly is the issue, and I'll get back. Okay, so after a bit of digging down into the errors, I was unable to make it compile for WASM on the 0.17 release. I have a hunch that the 0.17 release is not using a WASM compatible renderer, something to investigate later on. But as an alternative but temporary fix, what we can do is reference the most recent update to eFrame from GitHub. So instead of the version field, I'll use the Git field, which has the link to the eFrame repository, and I'll also pin it to a specific commit using the ref field so that our builds are reproducible. And this is one of the other ways that you can specify dependencies in your Crocodile. Okay, so with that, let's try to run the start web script again. And I think the previous error from 0.17 release is gone now. And what we have are the local errors that we have in our repository at present. So yeah, let's take a look at one of these and see if we can fix that. So I'll go to line 89, and here we have to take a mutable reference to frame, another one down. And the only error that we are left with now is this, which has to do with how we initialize our app. And now you can see start web accepts something called fn once. This is actually a closure instead of our headlines instance. So let's go to the start web function, and instead of box headlines, we'll have to pass in a closure here. So we will change this to closure, and this closure gets passed something called a creation context, which we'll come to in a moment. And then we'll need to box the headlines instance again. Okay, so let's try to run the start web script again, and that is fixed. Then there's another one at headlines.rs. So since frame is being mutably accessed, we need to change the way it is being referenced, which is the mutable reference. I'm going to change that, and let's run this again, and looks like it's working now. Let's open this up in our browser window, and here I'm going to put my API key, and seems like nothing much is happening here. And the reason for that is we haven't enabled all of the app initialization logic yet because we had commented this out. So what has changed in the app trait now is that the setup method no longer exists, and we only have the update method on the app trait. So any kind of state initialization needs to happen on the struct that's implementing the app trait, in this case headlines. So what we'll do is we'll go to where headlines is defined, and on headlines we'll add a new method called init, and this will get passed a type called creation context, and this method will return the headlines instance again to the caller, and within this we're going to add all of the logic that is present in the setup method. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so we ported most of the initialization logic within the init method. You can see that the init method takes self by value, and it's also mutable, and it also receives a type called creation context that is going to be passed from here. So then we have some familiar code from the last episode. So we first try to access the storage field from the creation context, and then we are trying to load any previous state of the app, and then we set up a few channels so we can send messages back and forth. And then here I've organized the cross-platform code in a more cleaner way. So all of the non-WASM related code goes into this scope, and within that we have the familiar code as before. And down below we have another scope that contains all of the code related to the WASM platform. And finally we call self.configure fonts, and we pass the context object from the creation context instance, and then we return the headlines instance itself. So with those changes, I think we should be good, and let's try to run the start web script again. And if I go up, okay, all right, so we need to import the fetch web method based on whether we are in a WASM platform. So we can do that by using config target arc, and under that we'll import fetch web, and hopefully this should fix that. Perfect. So if I open this now and put in my API key. Still no signs of things working correctly. Let's check the developer console. Okay, I think we know what the issue is. We actually forgot to call the init function here. So let's do that. We'll call headlines init, and let's rerun this again. Okay, we need to pass creation context. All right, I think we need to modify the signature of init to take creation context by reference, and this should fix this error. There you go. Let's open this up again, and things are working just as before. But if you take a look here, there is a bug in the way the first row of the news articles are being rendered. To be specific, I believe it has something to do with the read more button, which is using a right to left layout. So it's a layout bug, and in order to detect that, eGUI has a feature called the layout inspector. So using the context object, if we set debug on hover to true and we rerun our app, we should get bounding boxes around each of our widgets. So let's try that. I'm going to go back here, and within the update method, we have a reference to context object, and using this, I will invoke set debug on hover and set it to true. And let's try to rerun this again. And now if you take a look, you can see that we have bounding boxes around each of our widgets. And if I go to the rightmost layout, you can see that read more ends up taking a lot more vertical space than it needs. So let's go back into the code and look at the line where read more button is being rendered, and let's find out what we can do about it. So it should be within the rendered news cards method, and if I go down, you can see that we have the read more button being rendered. And if you notice, we are rendering this within a layout that's aligned from right to left. So let's take a look at the API for the layout object. And if you take a look at the right to left method, and I'm going to check the source code by clicking on the right. So it seems that the cross align attribute is by default set to align center, which might be the case that the read more button is being rendered center, because the cross align attribute defines how widgets are rendered from top to bottom. And if I go down, let me see if there is a way for us to modify the cross align attribute. All right, so we have a method called with cross align, using which we can set the desired cross alignment. So let's go back to the docs and check for the align type. And here you can see the align is an enum with 3 variants. By default, the cross align was set to center. So I think we can probably use min and it should fix our problem. So let's go back to headlines.rs, and I'm going to chain a method call to the layout instance, and I'm going to call with cross align. And for the alignment, I'm going to use the min variant, and let's try to run this again. And look at that, chaining the cross alignment actually fixed our issue. So next we have another layout bug that I want to fix, which is if you scroll at the very bottom, you can see that one of the rows in the scroll area widget is actually hidden behind the footer. So the footer is actually rendering on top of the scroll area widget. And the reason for that is how these top level panels, the top, the bottom, and the central panel are supposed to be added in eGUI. So if you go to the documentation of central panel, you can see that the very first line says that a panel that covers the remainder of the screen, that is whatever area is left for adding other panels. So this explains our issue with the last article that's being hidden. So if I go back to the update method where we actually render the central panel, you will see that in the render footer method, we're adding a top bottom panel, which is again a top level container widget. So in order for the central panel to render on top of any other panel, it has to be added at the very end. So what we can do is we'll move the render footer method and I'll move it right before the central panel. So that first we have the top panel being rendered, and then the footer is being rendered using the top bottom panel widget. And then finally we rendered the central panel widget, which should make it render on top of these two widgets. So let's try to run this again. And if I scroll down, you will see that the last row is being rendered correctly, and we have the entirety of the widget rendered here. So these were a few layout bugs that we had, and we can now probably remove these bounding boxes that was used for debugging purposes. So I'll go back to the update method and I'm just going to remove this. Now, all this while we had been running headlines within the browser. So let's also make sure that we're able to build it for the native platform. So I'm going to do cargo run here, and looks like we have an issue with the run native method. Let's go to this line, and it appears that the run native method now takes 3 arguments, whereas our previous code only passes 2 arguments. So let's take a look at the definition of run native, and it looks like we first need to pass an app name, which is a string, and then we pass the usual native options, and then our app creator instance, which we know from the librs main web method, where we needed to construct an fn1 closure. So I'm just going to copy it, and I'll go back to main.rs. And for the first argument, let's just name our app headlines, and we're going to move the native options argument as the second param, and this gets replaced with the app creator closure. I'm going to hit save, and headlines isn't found, so we can rename this to headlines, and we should be good to go. Let's try to run this again. All right, seems to be working as it should, and no more layout issues in this as well. Okay, but before we end this, I just want to take some time and remove a few warning log lines from a project. So I'll search for this error string. This error log comes from the preload articles. So let me actually remove this because it gets pretty noisy here. But obviously in a production environment, you should be logging these log lines to a place where you can analyze these logs for later reference. In case of Linux, you can probably log it to the var log directory. And in addition to this, let's also remove these warnings from a project. So let me run bacon and remove these one by one. For this method, since it returns a result, and because we are in a binary application, we can actually use expect to panic and crash the program because this operation is intended to be successful and not fail. So we can simply log it as failed sending refresh event. Similarly for this, and let's also remove a few warnings from compiling on the web platform. So if you go here, so this returns a result, so we can call expect and crash with a message saying failed to launch app. And this one isn't being used on the web platform, so we can annotate it with config not target arg equals to wasm32. So then let's fix the use statement for fetch news in headlines.rs. We'll do the same conditional import here, and this will only apply to fetch news. So let's move this to a different line, remove the right brace, and this thread module import is also not something that is present on the wasm platform. So let's use this again, and we will import std. We can remove this. All right, we're left with only one error now. Let's remove the mute keyword here, and we got rid of all the warnings. All right, so this brings us to the end of our refactoring session, and the whole point of this video was to demonstrate the developer experience of refactoring a Rust project, how to look for the documentation, how to understand the compiler error messages. Of course, it was a very sneak peek, but in the upcoming series on Rust basics, we're going to be going into all of these in much more detail. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you for staying with me this far, and I'll see you in the next one.